Hello, good morning everyone. Welcome to our main service at 64 Portage Road, Lynn, New Zealand Standard Time. Now this morning, I'd like to share with you this wonderful topic, thinking no evil. On the screen, we have Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8 as the main thought of this particular subject. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. On the screen we find here, you'll see here a picture of a Japanese pictorial philosophy representing three monkeys. The first one was covering its eyes, meaning sees no evil. The next one is covering its ears, hears no evil. And the third monkey on the picture, covering its mouth, who speaks no evil. That's the Japanese philosophy. We might add another monkey on the side of these three. I suppose that this monkey would cover its forehead, and that is thinking or think no evil. And that will be the most important of all of them, the fourth monkey. But we are not talking about any monkey business here, but we want to draw an important lesson, how important to control our mind. It is important what we see, what we hear, and what we speak. Speak no evil, sees no evil, and hear no evil. But you know, evil itself has more to do with the mind than with the three faculties suggested by this Japanese philosophy. And when we think no evil, and there's a good chance indeed that we can avoid seeing, hearing, and speaking evil. That is, if we control properly our minds and thoughts. The brain is the focus and center of our input and output. Yes, it is like the central processing unit of the computer, where all informations are processed. That is the input and the output of our being. So the eyes, the ears, and the tongue and other sensory organs are all linked, connected with the brain, and the brain is the thought center. And whatever enters or leaves the sensory organs, they are noted and is connected with the mind, and in a ways affects the way we think. Links in chains sin, or linked in sin's chain. So we are going to look at the steps to sin. The thought is one of the links in the chain that leads to sin. It is one. Now we have here 1 to 6, attention, consideration, desire, decision, plan, action. And the first 5 of these steps or links are all processed in the mind. The first one is attention. You see something, you hear something, you feel something, and you think something that tempts you to sin. By the way, temptation is not sin. And in this step or attention, there's no sin, because temptation here is just being brought to your attention. The next one is consideration. Sin may begin with the second link, with the consideration. Consideration or thought about the temptation that attracts attention. Let me read from Volume 4, Testimonies 623. Satan, that arch deceiver, transforms himself into an angel of light and comes to the youth with his specious temptations and succeeds in winning them step by step from the path of duty. So Satan comes to us, to the young people, as an angel of light. This is the most dangerous time when he comes to every one of us in the form of an angel of light. If he appears to us as an horrendous person, then people might be aware. You will be aware, oh, this is Satan, I have to run away. But coming as an angel of light makes you unprepared or unaware. And he could succeed over our young people, over our mind. The thoughts of the heart are discerned of God. Okay? The thoughts of the heart are discerned of God. When impure thoughts are cherished, they need not be expressed by word or act to consummate the sin and bring the soul into condemnation. His purity is defiled and the tempter has triumphed. So you see here, you don't need to express what's in your mind into action. Once you entertain the impure thoughts into your mind, then you are defiled and the tempter or Satan has triumphed already in our thoughts. So you see how important is the thought. So going back to these steps to sin, the third step is desire. We don't need to get all the way through the 5 steps to action. In other words, you don't need to go from first, second, third, fourth, and fifth steps in order to act. As we discussed already, that consideration could begin the commitment of sin. Now let us talk about desire. We don't need, as I said, to get all the way through the 5 steps to action before committing sin. To permit the third step to develop, which is the wrong desire, is sin. Now an example of this, in Matthew chapter 5 verse 28, Jesus Christ said this, "But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust," that is, of course, desire and wrong desire, "after her had committed adultery with her already in his heart." So when we have the wrong desire toward something else, then that will be sin. So therefore, the temptation must be rooted out from its very inception in the mind if we are to prevent it becoming sin. Take it out from the mind before it develops into sin. And it all depends on how the mind deals with the sight, sound, feeling, or thought that decides whether the individual goes through the remaining steps. Number 4 is decision. Temptation must not be entertained by the mind at all. We must decide, we must resolve that we must not entertain any temptation. Every suspicious looking stimulus knocking at the door of your mind must be met thoroughly. And swift decision in the right direction is essential. Like Joseph, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Shun away. man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust or wrong desire and enticed. He is turned away from the course of virtue and real good by following his own inclinations. If the youth possess moral integrity, the strongest temptations might be presented in vain. So, if we will not entertain temptation, then even how strong is that temptation, it will be presented in vain. And like Joseph, how can I sin against, do this great wickedness and sin against God? It is Satan's act to tempt you, but your own act to yield. It is not in the power of all the hosts of Satan to force the tempted to transgress. There is no excuse for sin. So, Satan always brings temptations in front of us, to our attention. But you cannot blame Satan for that. That is his own work. Your own action is to yield or not. Either you refuse or not, that's your own choice. If you yield, you are accountable for that. And Satan will not force us to yield to temptation. And there is no excuse for sin. When you yield to temptation, you commit sin, and there's no excuse for sin. Because if sin could be excused, then there's no need for Adam and Eve to be expelled from the Garden of Eden. And there's no need for Christ to come down to earth and die on the cross to pay for our sin, if sin can be excused. So, repulsing temptation immediately. There are thoughts and feelings suggested and aroused by Satan that annoy even the best of men. But if they are not cherished, if they are repulsed as hateful, the soul is not contaminated with guilt, and no other is defiled by their influence. So what we need to do is stop cherishing the thoughts, that suggestion from Satan. We have to repulse them as a hateful thing. Do not love them. Do not cherish them. Because if you cherish, if you entertain that in your mind, then you will be contaminated with guilt and you will be defiled by its influence in the mind. Yielding to temptation begins in permitting the mind to waver, to be inconstant in your trust in God. If we do not choose to give ourselves fully to God, then we are in darkness. When we make any reserve, we are leaving open a door through which Satan can enter to lead us astray by his temptations. A wavering mind is opening the door for Satan to enter. That's why James said that a wavering person is like a wave of the sea that is being tossed to and fro, unstable, and that can open the door for Satan to enter and lead us astray through his temptation. By parleying with the enemy, we give him an advantage. Parleying means hold a conference with the opposing side to discuss terms, like what Eve had done in the Garden of Eden, talking to the serpent. She was discussing to the serpent, and at the end she was tempted and fell to sin. The thoughts must be bound about, restricted, withdrawn from branching out and contemplating things that will only weaken and defile the soul. The thoughts must be pure, the meditations of the heart must be clean, if the words of the mouth are to be words acceptable to heaven and helpful to your associates. So we need to repulse immediately the thoughts that can weaken our soul, those evil thoughts. There's a prayer in Psalms 19, probably the final verse. It says that let the words of our mouth and meditations of our heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. But if our thoughts are not pure, so how can the words of our mouth be acceptable to heaven? So not an empty mind. Now, toward maintaining a clean mind requires more than just banishing evil thoughts. Yes, that is the first one, to banish every evil thoughts from our minds. But that is not just enough to maintain a pure mind. Because if it is only possible for us to empty those evil thoughts from our minds, then what will be the result is an empty mind. Obviously, the positive act of thinking good thoughts is essential as well. In fact, the thinking of good thoughts is the only reasonable way in which a person can exclude bad thoughts. So to banish the negative thoughts from your minds, you need to think positively. In order to banish evil thoughts from our mind, then you need to think good things. Like in a physical world, no two materials or substances can occupy the same space at the same time. Well, if they attempt to do that, to occupy the same space at the same time, there will be collision, like two cars would occupy the same space and time, then there will be collision. That will be ruin and accident. In our thoughts as well, in our mental domain, no two thoughts can occupy the same mind at the same time. Either you have to entertain the bad thoughts or the good thoughts. You cannot mix them. Well, mixing them would result to bad thoughts as well. In a mathematical equation, like negative multiplied with a positive number will result to a negative result. So same thing, okay? So this idea is expressed by the Apostle Paul, and we read them in our scripture reading a while ago. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Wonderful. Now, there are many things. If you understand this principle of the Apostle Paul, these are enough to banish all the evil thoughts from our minds. If we would permit our minds to dwell upon more Christ, upon Christ and the heavenly world, we should find a powerful stimulus and support in fighting the battles of the Lord. That's amazing. Thinking about victory over sin and besetment. There's one thing that we need to understand and do, that we need to allow our minds to dwell upon more on Christ and the heavenly world. I know that there are, according to the Spirit prophecy, there are many things that we can put into our minds. In the world, there is pride and love of the world will lose their power as we contemplate the glories of that better land so soon be our home. So could you imagine? It can banish pride from us when we think about Christ and the heavenly world. It can banish the love of the world. Beside the loveliness of Christ, all earthly attractions will seem of little worth. While in the wilderness, now this is what Christ taught us in his experience in the wilderness. He was tempted for 40 days in the wilderness. And let us see what was his experience in those 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. While in the wilderness, Christ fasted, but he was insensible to hunger. engaged in constant prayer to his Father for a preparation to resist the adversary, Christ did not feel the pangs of hunger. It was amazing to think about that Christ never feel any hungry. Why? He was insensible to that because he was engaged in constant prayer to his Father. He was locked in, and that's why he did not feel the pangs of hunger. You know, my experience before when I was when I joined prayer and fasting, the first prayer and fasting, I remember that I joined. I could recall that during the hours of fasting, every one of us as well, were thinking, when could the day be over so that we could eat? And all of the time, we were thinking about delicious foods. But not with Christ. Christ fasted and he was insensible to that. He spent the time in earnest prayer, shut in with God. It was as if he were in the presence of his Father. He sought for strength to meet the foe, for the assurance that he would receive grace to carry out all that he had undertaken in behalf of humanity. The thought of the warfare before him made him oblivious to all else. Oblivious meaning he was not aware or concerned about what's happening around him. So, because he had the thought of the engagement of warfare that is before him when he's finished when he finished these 40 days of fasting, he was thinking about that, looking forward to that warfare. And because of that, he prayed earnestly for strength, and he was shut in with his Father. That's why he did not feel or the pangs of hunger or aware of what's going on around him. And his soul was fed with the bread of life, just as today those tempted souls will be fed who go to God for aid. He ate of the truth which he was to give to the people as having power to deliver them from Satan's temptation. What was the first temptation of Satan? To Christ. If thou art be the Son of God, command that these stones be turned into bread. But Christ said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So Christ was fed with the bread of life, not the bread that, the physical bread, but he was fed with the bread of life. And this bread of life he offered to those souls that would go to God for help. Christ ate the truth. That was his food during those 40 days of fasting. And this is the kind of food that he wants to give to the people. And this kind of food, the bread of life, has power to deliver them from the temptations of Satan. But of course, we need the literal food, the literal bread, to sustain our physical body. But we need the spiritual bread of life to sustain our spiritual life. So, with these ideas, we find one important reason why it is essential that we read this and study the Bible and the Spirit of Prophecy writing. So we have the Bible with us, and together with the Spirit of Prophecy writings. Mental discipline is not always easy. It's challenging, but good. Result, brethren. Mental discipline is not always easy. This is especially the case when the thoughts have been permitted or encouraged for years to run in a wrong channel, or simply entertaining any idea that happen along. Let us read here. When the mind has been long permitted to dwell only on earthly things, it is difficult matter to change the habits of thought. That which the eye sees and the ear hears too often attracts the attention and absorbs the interest. So you see, when our mind is occupied with common things, earthly things, it is difficult to change that habit. That's why mental discipline is not always easy. Because what we commonly see and commonly hears can occupy and absorb our attention. But if we would ever enter the city of God, if we want to enter the paradise that God prepared for those who are saved, if we want to enter the city of God and look upon Jesus in His glory, we must become accustomed to beholding Him with the eye of faith here. So, in other words, our sense should be refocused towards the better land. So we should start looking forward to the better land if we want to have a right direction in thinking. So we need to look forward to the time. We need to look forward right now, from now on, to Jesus. We must look forward to Jesus in His glory with the eye of faith here. The words and the character of Christ should be often the subject of our thoughts and of our conversation, and each day sometimes should be especially devoted to prayer, meditation upon these sacred themes. So that's why, in order for us to have a better thought, we must have the mind of Christ. We need to often talk about this subject in our thoughts and in our conversation. That is in what we are talking about. That is on a daily basis. We need to meditate upon this. So we need to see it, we need to talk about it and meditate upon this. But we need not to struggle alone. It is not easy for mental discipline, but we need not to struggle alone. Why? Let's see here, if they are weak, if you are weak in virtue and purity of thoughts and acts, they can obtain help from the friend of the helpless. Jesus is acquainted with all the weaknesses of human nature, and if entreated, will give strength to overcome the most powerful temptations. All can obtain this strength if they seek for it in humility. Wonderful. So we have a helper. We have Jesus, who is acquainted with our weak thoughts, the weaknesses of human nature, and He will give us the strength to overcome even the most powerful of all temptations, because He will give us the strength if we seek it. Now Jesus Christ gave us another example, and I'm going to share these thoughts from Great Controversy. Not even by a thought could our Savior be brought to yield to the power of temptation. Satan finds in human hearts some point where he can gain a foothold. Some sinful desire is cherished by means of which his temptations asserts their power. So Satan strikes us at our weak points. It's that sinful desire in our hearts. But he could not find such even a thought in Jesus Christ. He could not bring Christ to yield to his temptation. But Christ, according to John 14 verse 30, Christ declared of Himself, "The prince of this world cometh and had nothing in me." That's why Satan's temptation could not gain a foothold over Christ because there is nothing in him that can yield to Satan's temptation. Satan could find nothing in the Son of God that would enable him to gain the victory. This is powerful. If he had kept his Father's commandments, and there was no sin in him that Satan could use to his advantage. So you see, there was no sin in him that Satan could use to his advantage. And this is the condition in which those must be found who shall stand in the time of trouble. You know, we find in the last hours, or in the last hour of Christ on earth, that was before his death, that Satan inflict all the kind of pain through torture, lacerations, and emotions. Emotional temptation. Why? Because he would suggest the thoughts, oh, look, one of your disciples betray you. And where are the other disciples? Where's Peter? They will forsake you. You're alone here. That was painful. And what about that? Lashes at the backs and all over. So Satan was trying to tempt Christ to use his God power to save himself, and would resort to the annulment of the plan of salvation. If Christ yielded to that temptation, then the plan of salvation will be null and void. That's why Satan was trying to inflict all the kinds of pain, physically and emotionally. But we need the mind of Christ. Why? Because this is the condition in which those must be found who shall stand in the time of trouble. Even today, in this pandemic, you can hear news from all over the world that many were committing suicide. Why? Because of mental depression. They cannot get over the depression that is going on around them because of this pandemic. Their mind cannot bear it. That's why in New Zealand, Australia, and all over the world there are cases of suicide, especially for the young people. We might think that isolating at home is a safe place, but not during the pandemic times. There are many reports of suicide that happens while in a lockdown. There's another thought that needs to be considered. There are some topics, although good in themselves, that the Christian should not take time to become involved with. Now let us see here from the Ministry of Health 456. We must turn away from 1,000 topics that invite attention. There are matters that consume time and arouse inquiry, but end in nothing. The highest interests demand the close attention and energy that are so often given to comparatively insignificant things. And you see thousand topics, they are good themselves, some of them, and most of them, let us say, but we should not get involved with them. Why? It only consumes time, curiosity, arouse curiosity, but results in zero, nothing. No profit at all. Does not help even us to become spiritual or godly. So life is short. Let us remember that time is passing and probation is brief. We have but a few years at most in which the perfect characters for eternity. Let us pray that God will give us more chance, will lengthen the time of probation so that we can be like Jesus Christ. We can have the mind of Christ. Christ is coming. We're looking forward to the coming of Christ in the clouds of heaven. But for those who understand his work in the heavenly sanctuary, we are looking forward to the time when he comes out from the most holy place. And we ought to live and act holy with reference to the coming of the Son of Man. And in the emphasis on mental discipline, there's one thought we must ever bear in mind. And what is that? That maybe Christ alone can direct the thoughts aright. He alone can give noble aspiration and fashion the character after the divine similitude. So only Christ can direct our thoughts in a right direction, in a right channel. And He can give us noble aspiration, fashion our character, mold our character after His character. So only Christ can do that. That's why we have to pray. According to the Apostle Paul, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus. We must have the mind of Christ. If we draw near to Him in earnest prayer, He will fill our hearts with high and holy purposes and with deep longings for purity and righteousness. The dangers thickening around us demand from those who have an experience in the thing of God a watchful supervision. Do not let your guard down. We are on a dangerous situation. We are in a pandemic. The whole world is surrounded with virus. And Satan is surrounding us with a virus of sin and temptation. So that do not let your guard down. We want to emphasize here the need of closing the mind to every suggestion of evil, and the need or the importance of having a mind open to the truths of God that is found or are found in the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy writings. In fact, to the same level that we close our minds to all sinful thoughts, we should open them to the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy. And how shall we stand in the day of trouble? Those who endeavor to obey all the commandments of God will be opposed and derided. Now we have to prepare for that. They can stand only in God. In order to endure the trial before them, they must understand the will of God as revealed in His Word. So what we need today here, we profess to be commandment keepers, commandment keeping people of God. But remember, brethren, that in any way you will be opposed and derided. Somebody will oppose these commandment keeping people. And the pandemic, the issue today is narrowing down so that these commandment keeping people who are not known so well will be known. And it's narrowing down today. This day, this pandemic will bring to that point, or can lead to that point. And they can honor Him only as they have the right conception of His character, government, and purposes, and act in accordance with them. None but those who have fortified the mind with the truths of the Bible will stand through the last great conflict. So, what we need today is the mind of Christ. Fill your minds with the truth from the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy. Fill your minds with the present truth, important truths that can banish the evil thoughts. We need the mind of Christ, because this is the only one, I repeat again, that those who fortify the mind with Bible truth will stand through the last great conflict. How we study and talk about country living. Well, country living can help us as well, but it's not all about that. Standing in the last struggle is not only involve country living. Why? Because there are many people who live outside the city, but they bring the city to the country. I remember our experience in the Philippines, as I heard them, that there are some group of sincere Christians went to a place where it's far from civilization. But you can find, when you go to the place, you can find television. You can find things that's supposed to be just to be there in the city. So what is really country living? Do not bring the city to the country. And the most important thing in order to stand in this last struggle, in this last conflict, in the time of trouble, is we need to have the mind of Christ. Because if we have the mind of Christ, wherever you go, you can stand against the deception and temptations of Satan. But if you don't have the mind of Christ, even if you live in the country, then you will fall into Satan's temptation. That's why what we need on the top of securing ourselves in a safe place, we need the mind of Christ today. We need the mind of Christ. And we need to fortify that mind with the Bible truth. But I'm not discouraging to go to find a safe place these days. Especially that's the only in the countryside that you can save yourself from relying on the market for food. You can raise in the countryside. You can plant your own foods and live there peacefully. But that is only one thing. It's not everything. On the top of that, we need the mind of Christ. Now is the time to prepare. The seal of God will never be placed upon the forehead of an impure man or woman. It will never be placed upon the forehead of the ambitious, world-loving man or women. It will never be placed upon the forehead of men or women of false tongues and deceitful hearts. All who receive the seal must be without spot before God, candidates for heaven. That's why we need to consider thoughtfully what we see, hear, and speak. If what we speak are deceitful or we speak lies, then how can we expect the seal of God in our forehead, in our mind? How can we have the mind of Christ? Because in order to receive the seal of God, the seal of God's protection in our forehead, we must have the mind of Christ and candidates for heaven. So let us consider these things, brethren, thoughtfully. And let us ask the Lord to help us overcome the temptations of Satan in our thoughts. And let us pray for the mind of Christ to be our mind. And we will surely receive the seal of God and the seal of His protection. And we are candidates for heaven. May the Lord bless you all, and may the Lord be with you always, even in this time of pandemic. Stay safe and be safe. God bless again.